41 here on the Radio Wammo Breakfast.
This was not meant as a show of force aimed at China or any other rising power in the region. Instead, the U.S. and the Philippines insist these joint military exercises are only meant to increase cooperation between allies. But while this was going on in the Philippines, the U.S. was involved in a similar exchange with Vietnam. All this while tension with China escalates because of territorial disputes over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea.
This is Eye on the World with Paul Buchanan joining me. Good morning to you, Paul.
Good morning.
And today we're talking about this tension rising in the South China Sea. And you could, I guess, be forgiven for not knowing that this, in fact, was going on, but it is a big deal, right, Paul?
It is. In fact, the South China Sea has the potential to become the next shatter zone, and I'll explain what a shatter zone is in a second, but it's interesting because it has caught the attention of Southeast Asians in a major way, but to most of the Western press, attention is still fixated on the Middle East and Central Asia. So the strategic logics, though, are compelling to suggest that, in fact, what we have in the making in Southeast Asia not only is the possibility of major conflict, but an ongoing arms race that serves to fuel that conflict, if you will. And it's basically rooted in one simple fact. There are at least 6 contending claims for territory in and around the South China Sea, and the biggest claim comes from China. And that claim overlaps claims with Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, Vietnam, and it is on top of bilateral claims between Malaysia and Thailand, Thailand and Cambodia. So the region is full of festering disputes, all set against the backdrop of U.S.-China power competition as China begins to emerge as a major player. And the irony here is that the economic growth of the last decade in Southeast Asia, these countries have averaged over 5% growth rates, in general, for over a decade, has fueled the modernization of their military programs. And of course, in the measure that they militarize and increase their military capabilities, they're going to try to expand their presence in the region. And we've now had several incidents, including armed incidents, not only between the Chinese and some of the other actors in the region, but between, again, Malaysians and Thais and what have you, all set against, again, a backdrop of the United States trying to contain China before it emerges as a full-fledged challenger in the Pacific. So I think that we, being dependent on our relationship with Southeast Asia and China, need to be very aware of these contending disputes. And certainly the United States has already made the effort to try to cement its alliances, its security alliances, with all of the contenders other than China. And so we have the makings of something that could spill over into armed conflict in the near future.
And what's the extent of the claims in territory there? I mean, how complicated is it?
Well, I guess the way to look at it is this way. The reasons for all these claims stem from 2 basic facts. One is free transit through the sea lanes of communication that go through the South China Sea, and 2, the possibility of resource exploitation in the South China Sea. As you'll see from the map, you can see the overlapping claims in the northern part of the South China Sea, and quite frankly, China. Their claims overlap with, again, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam, to the point that China claims territory that is within sight of the shores of the Philippines. And it's not just the Spratly Islands. There's something called the Scarborough Shoals. And the reason these little dots in the ocean matter is that occupation is 3/4 of possession. And the belief is that underneath these islands are potential natural gas and oil reserves that, obviously enough, people want to get a hold of. The other thing to keep in mind is that China, as it's emerging as a great power, depends 80% of its raw material imports transit through the South China Sea. So it is building a navy to be able to protect those sea lanes of communication under something known as the three-island chain doctrine. And basically, the first island chain extends from Japan to the Philippines down to Singapore. And that is what China claims as its territorial lake, if you will. Very akin to the way the United States looks at the Caribbean. And needless to say, the other countries in the region do not appreciate these sort of claims. And in particular, the standoff between the Vietnamese and the Chinese, who have historical enmities, has resulted in shooting disputes to the tune of about a half a dozen in the last 5 years. So it's all about, they say in real estate, it's all about location, location, location. Well, the location of the South China Sea is absolutely crucial to the livelihoods not only of China but of its neighbors. And again, the backdrop to all of this is the United States wants to contain China, keep it inside its lake, if you will. And so the United States has developed security relations with virtually all of the other countries to the point that now there is a security cordon that extends from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, and Singapore. The United States now has bilateral security agreements with all of these countries, conducts exercises with them on a regular basis, as we saw in the first clip. And needless to say, the Chinese do not appreciate it because they see it for what it is. It's another manifestation of a U.S. containment policy towards China.
So it's a power play, essentially, between the two superpowers, with these minor players caught in the middle, I suppose.
Well, the thing is, the disputes between the minor players have a life of their own as well. The way we look at it in international relations is something called nested games. And without getting too complicated, think of those Russian dolls. The smallest doll is its characteristics are constrained by the presence of the other dolls in which it's inserted. Well, Singapore has disputes with Indonesia and Malaysia over islands off its shore. Singapore is very small, but is spending 6% of its GDP on the military. It has one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the region. And so they have their disputes. Again, Malaysia and Thailand have a dispute. Malaysia and the Philippines have a dispute. So all of these little bilateral disputes are set against the backdrop of the big power play between the United States and China. And let's not forget that India is in the mix. India is a traditional rival of China. India is a great power in the making. And lo and behold, India has started to develop a naval capability that includes, among other things, establishing a bilateral relationship with Vietnam, another traditional rival of China. So this thing is starting to get very messy. And I will say this, although the Chinese are always portrayed as the evildoers in all of this because they are very aggressive, what they've tried to do, while still asserting their claims by force, is to not use military ships, but instead use fisheries, enforcement vessels, and Coast Guard vessels to put the point out that even though they're asserting these claims, they're not doing it in a very military way. They're simply using their civilian patrol craft in order to assert the claims. And that's something that has been taken on board by the United States. One thing that's remarkable is that the United States, rather than engage in gunboat diplomacy and send a carrier to reinforce the Filipino and the Vietnamese claims, has urged negotiations and at best sends ships through the sea lanes in international waters just to mark a presence, but without being overtly provocative. And I would say this is simply because a shatter zone is an area where great powers have the potential to enter into direct armed conflict. A shatter zone, for example, was Central Europe during the Cold War. And
I was thinking that there seem to be similarities here, right, between this situation and the Cold War?
Well, that's exactly the point, is that the South China Sea is becoming the demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, because I misspoke. It's highly militarized.
Yeah.
but is equivalent to Central Europe in that respect, although neither the United States or China admit that they're in a standoff. I mean, it's the elephant in the room is that the United States and China are strategic rivals, don't like each other very much for a variety of reasons. And I would say from the Chinese point of view, they do have a complaint because the United States has ring-fenced around them with all these bilateral security alliances exploiting traditional enmities. I'll say something that may sound controversial, but I guess you'd have to live in Southeast Asia to understand this. The Chinese in Southeast Asia are the equivalent of Jews in Europe. That is to say, they are disproportionately represented in the merchant class, in the banking class. They're very entrepreneurial. They're extremely efficient, very ruthless, and ethnic Chinese communities, because of their success, have been resented in places, particularly in places like Malaysia, but also in Indonesia. The only place where ethnic Chinese are accepted as full equals in Singapore is Singapore, and that's because Singapore is a Chinese-dominant country. The United States is exploiting this anti-Chinese sentiment throughout the region, and of course, naturally enough, the Chinese resent it, and so do the ethnic Chinese populations of all of these countries. The only two countries where Chinese are accepted, by and large, is particularly Thailand, and to a lesser extent Philippines, but all of this jingoistic action between the Chinese and the Filipinos over, again, the Scarborough Shoals and the Spratlys has agitated anti-Chinese sentiment in the Philippines as well. And there have been anti-Chinese demonstrations throughout the region now on a yearly basis. And I would simply point out that from the Chinese perspective, this is unfair. And it seems as if the United States is helping stir the pot. And that increases what we call the security dilemma. Security dilemma is when a country perceiving itself to be surrounded or threatened increases its military capability. But in the measure that it does so, it scares its neighbors who then militarize accordingly, thereby ratcheting up the whole thing and raising the possibility of an unintentional or miscalculated conflict. And that therein lies the rub, is that the possibility, the more naval vessels we put into this body of water, the more nationalist sentiment agitates against the Chinese and vice versa, the more likely there is of a unexpected armed conflict between, caused by a misunderstanding or the like. And given the levels of technology involved, because all of these countries now have significant militaries, to include submarine fleets, China, of course, is building its first carrier, the possibilities of an armed dispute escalating in something equivalent of a regional war cannot be discounted.
Certainly, it's another case of watch the space or watch that sea, the South China Sea we've been talking about with Paul Buchanan from 36-parallel.com, where you'll find analysis there. And also find this as a video once more up at livenews.co.nz. Thanks very much, Paul.
All right, cheers.